So if you've ever gotten pushback about the 3-day special military operation, let me fix that for you right here. This is my three big stories segment. We're actually going to talk about 5 different stories here, but okay, let's get into this. How it started versus how it's going. The evolution of Russian propagandists from Kyiv in 3 days to it's good to that there's a counterterrorism operation declared in the Kursk region. Okay, in a hot war, we'll defeat Ukraine in 2 days. What's the big deal? So not even 3, but 2. But let's look at this because we're now just starting the 301st 3-day special military operation. And if you thought that, because I hear this all the time, I point to it, it's supposed to be 3 days or 3 weeks to mop up or whatever. And people will say, well, they never said that. Here, they're saying that. In a hot war, we'll defeat Ukraine in 2 days. What's the big deal? Kyiv will be taken so quickly, 1.5 or 3 days. 2 days, and then the city falls. We'll raise an eyebrow, and Ukraine will realize everything. We'll take Kyiv. Okay, they talk about it again and again, and like they said it, you can see it with your own eyes. Okay, next, in the center of Magadan, pro-Russian Z patriots held a march called for Kursk and Belgorod. Okay, so where is Magadan? Let's look at this first before anything else. Magadan is some obscure place out here. Let me zoom out. See where we are on the map? Zoom out. Like, what? You're like over, like, okay, Ukraine's over here. They're talking about it over here. What's going on? Okay. This is a march on Washington, but it's in Magadan, Russia. For Belgorod, Kherson, Kursk, Crimea, let's take the United States into our crosshairs. And they're threatening like nuclear saber rattling. Like, okay, yes, Sarmat and Poseidon, we are targeting Washington. To Washington. Okay. Okay. Yeah, really? Okay, guys. Now, meanwhile, Alexei Smirnov, the Kursk governor, he's meeting with Putin. Ukraine has penetrated. Well, actually, I'm not even going to read on top. Let's look at it on the bottom. Situation in the region is complicated, he's telling Putin. Today, 28 settlements are under enemy control. That's Ukrainian control. Depth of penetration in Kursk Oblast is 12 kilometers. Front line width is 40 kilometers. And then he's going to be interrupted by Putin. Listen, the military department will report to you about the depth and width. Don't tell us what you actually know. Tell us about the socioeconomic situation and aid. What? So the military will tell you what the facts really are, is what he's saying. But by the way, his report of 12 by 40, that means about 480 square kilometers. And what we know from Syrskyi, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrskyi, declared that Ukraine now controls around 1,000 kilometers of Russian territory. But I'm sure Putin would have reduced this to something more like, maybe 150 kilometers or something. I mean, that's, yeah, I'm going to be looking for that coming. Now, Putin did say this, and I thought this was interesting because he's understanding what's going on. Apparently, the enemy seeks to improve its negotiating position in the future. But what kind of, and that's true, but it's not the only part. There's more to it than that. But listen to what he says. Like, how can he even say this with a straight face? But what kind of negotiations can we even talk about with people who indiscriminately conduct strikes at civilians and civilian infrastructure or try to create threats to nuclear power facilities? I mean, I don't even know what to say here, and I'm usually not at a loss for words. Exactly, says Anton Gerashenko, Russia attacks Ukrainian civilians, occupied a nuclear power plant, destroys our infrastructure. Wow. Okay, let's go to big story number 3. So Israel is put on high military alert as the U.S. sends assets to the Middle East. This is the Wall Street Journal. Here, CNN, Israel and U.S. brace for Iranian attack as diplomats push hard for Gaza ceasefire. So why am I talking about Israel and the Middle East when we're talking about Russia? Well, okay, Palestinian Authority Mahmoud Abbas has arrived in Moscow, propagandists have reported, and you see it again in the Times of Israel. Abbas arrives in Moscow ahead of meeting with Putin. Okay, so Putin is a great beneficiary of whatever has happened since October 7th in Israel, the Israel-Gaza conflict. And good people can disagree about what, who Israel or Gaza or that kind of thing and how they're going to frame and understand this. But let's not kid ourselves. The more that the world is focused on Israel and Gaza, the less they're focused on Ukraine. And this is a one-issue channel focused on Ukraine. The less they're focused on Ukraine, the more it benefits Putin. Okay, so that's why this is important. U.S. is deploying a submarine and carrier strike group to the Middle East. And again, what happens in Israel is going to take U.S. eyes off what's going on in Ukraine. So this is pretty important for all those reasons. Meanwhile, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is talking about how he's meeting with a bipartisan delegation of U.S. senators. It's only a few of them, but here we are. It's important that the Ukrainians and Americans are truly victorious in our defense of normal life and people's freedom. Today, I met with U.S. Senate delegation. We discussed exactly what is needed to bring this war to a just end, including our need to use long-range weapons. I thank America for supporting our defense. And again, Ukraine has still been asking and still not getting permission to use ATACMS to attack Russian military airfields within range, within ATACMS range. And they know where these planes are. They know where the missiles are launched from, and they simply haven't gotten permission from the White House to do it. Ukrainian authorities are negotiating with the U.S. to obtain permission to use ATACMS to attack Russian military airfields, the Washington Post is writing. This is Senator Graham talking about how the Ukrainian operation in Kursk region is bold, brilliant, and beautiful. Okay, Graham calls on the Biden administration to provide Ukraine with all weapons in order to win a war that cannot be lost. Okay, so Republicans were in the way. By the way, if you don't know me because you've just joined recently, I'm a Republican. I do not support MAGA. I'm not pro-Trump. I'm not voting for Trump, but I'm a Republican. That's the worldview through which I see things. And Graham is correct here. It was Republicans that held up the aid package, but it is Biden who can determine just by executive order, yes, you are allowed to strike deep into Ukraine. Graham also added that Putin started the war, kick his rear end. Okay, breaking. Now, this is from a site, Republicans Against Trump. This is Frank Luntz. He's a Republican pollster. He is predicting that if the election were held today, Vice President Harris would win, and here's why. The Harris voters are even more eager to vote for her than Donald Trump voters are for him. We haven't seen that in the entire campaign. So this enthusiasm gap has shifted significantly. Now, there's 84 days to the U.S. election, and that's a lot of time. When I say that's a lot of time, here's what I mean. So I looked at the time between June 27th and August 12th. Well, June 27th, midday, as it is right now, as I'm talking, Biden hadn't yet had that disastrous debate with Donald Trump. And then after that, Donald Trump is, there's the assassination attempt, and then the Republican convention, and all the enthusiasm is there on the Republican side. And then Biden dropped out. And then Kamala Harris raised $200 million in just a few days. And so a lot can shift in a very little bit of time. So yes, there's 84 days, but 84 days is a long time in political life. Okay, last little bit. Don't ever let anyone tell you that Russia is the victim. Russia's not the victim. And I was talking to my son about this earlier because he was asking about NATO. Like, didn't Putin just not want Ukraine to join NATO? They couldn't. There was a war within their borders and they couldn't join NATO at the time. It was not about that. In fact, it was only because they weren't in NATO that Putin invaded Ukraine. Okay, last little bit. Commit war crimes, play the victim, and that's Russia. That's the mix that they're involved in. All right, my friends, thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.